we just finished reading the papers on prom week, on Comme il faut and prom week, and on bad news. So it's my honor and pleasure to present our guest speaker, Dr. Ben Samuel, who's an assistant professor at the University of New Orleans in the Department of Computer Science, and was a key part of both prom week and bad news and several other very cool projects, and has continued to do interactive narrative research, especially on the sort of strong autonomy side. And so with that, I will let Ben take it away.
Okay, fantastic. So, hello, Ryan, Luke, Jeremiah, Michael, Rachel. Oh, Rachel, hi. Mira and Corey. It is a pleasure to see and meet you all. As Stephen so kindly said, I've worked on all of these projects that I'm very excited to share with you about. I'm honored that you read the papers. This presentation could easily take an hour, but my understanding is we only have 50 minutes with each other. So I'm going to go through this extremely quickly and hopefully open it up to questions. And then if there's questions that would benefit from these slides, we can do that. But yeah, basically what I am excited about is, blah, 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 blah. What I'm excited about is this notion of shared authorship. Stories, as I'm sure you know, are an incredibly important way for us to understand ourselves, each other, and the world that we live in. There are ways of engendering empathy with each other, and stories, of course, are intrinsically motivating. We want to get through them, and with games and interactive stories in particular, we not only have the power to find out what happens next, but to create what happens next. All of this is to say, stories make people care. And we can leverage that in lots of really wonderful, exciting ways. Clearly, there are a ton of games that have stories. Here's just a small smattering of them. Here's one of my all-time favorites, and Dr. Ware's as well. The Secret of Monkey Island. And Guybrush Threepwood in this game has this dream of becoming a pirate, and it's great, and it's wonderful, and you help him do it through gameplay. But the story of Guybrush is more or less completely canonical. My Monkey Island experience is going to be the same as your Monkey Island experience, save for maybe some slight ordering differences. You might say, well, that's just Monkey Island. There's all sorts of games like, oh, I don't know, Telltale games or The Walking Dead, where you have all of these choices that make a difference. But it's true, yeah, there's some branching story paths, and and it's not just Telltale games. It's it's Virtue's Last Reward. It's the Zero Escape series. It's tons of games. And it's not just games. It's books. It's the Choose Your Own Adventure novel series from back in the 70s and the 80s. People have been doing this for a long time, and we can see that it's branching storylines in and of themselves are, I would say, insufficient to truly give the player control over being an active member of the story that they're creating. And maybe you're saying, well, here's a different game. Here's Mass Effect. This is a game that's completely lauded for player choice, but it still is using those same underlying structures. And it still ends up finding that same problem that you end up finding with all those other ones, where it's the process maybe has all of this wonderful divergence, but it ends up converging back again into a relatively small subset of experiences. And this is in contrast to other systems within the same games. So this is, again, a screenshot from Mass Effect. In the combat, you're making a ton of these real-time decisions. You're making a ton of okay, what spell should I use? What weapon should I equip? Where should I go? Where should I duck? Who should I fight first? And all of those decisions are making all of these really wonderful ripples effect that don't necessarily have that same sense of convergence at the end. The combat really goes in any number of directions. And that is the kind of thing that I'm trying to create, that I'm excited to create in a narrative setting. Because unlike systems like this, I make the claim that game stories aren't playable in most cases. But I think that they should be. And this is where my research then lies, this idea of trying to create underlying systems that enable games, enable stories where the player is an active participant in its actual outcome, as opposed to simply selecting from pre-existing choices and experiencing one of a subset of decisions that an author made ahead of time, even if maybe that subset of choices is very large. And clearly, I'm not the only person doing this in academia, including people such as your esteemed professor are also pushing on these very same problems. So I don't want to make it sound like I'm alone in this front. It's very united. I've worked on lots of projects. I'm most excited to chat about Bad News and Prom Week with you all. But just to let you know, this work has application areas in lots of places, as I'm sure you can imagine. Spy Feet leveraged dynamic, quest generation, dynamic story generation in a mobile application game meant to encourage young people to go out and exercise. I don't know how many of you have played the game Unmanned. Unmanned, it was this award-winning game that had a kind of a split screen. On one side of the screen, you're performing little mundane mini games like shaving or driving to work. And on the other hand, you're kind of doing a dialogue selection process of what your character is internally wrestling with and what you're... We don't need to go into too much detail about that, but basically the idea of juxtapositioning mini gameplay with story choices and having them interplay with each other and having all of that be dynamically generated specifically to achieve specific rhetorical goals. I want to create a story, or I want to create a game in which the player is confronted with scarcity, and then the system basically figures out what set of mechanics based on what the player has already done, based on storytelling that has already happened, a set of mechanics to expose to them. Again, very quick explanations here. I apologize. We talked about, or I also was involved in this Immerse project. This was this big research effort that was in collaboration with the Department of Defense, where we basically used some of these shared authorship techniques. We used kind of a modified version of Comme il faut to power characters in this kind of embodied, this is, now that VR exists, this would be done in VR today, but we jury-rigged a Kinect to enable this kind of embodied, fully bodied, real-time interaction with these virtual characters who were, again, listening not only to what you were saying, but also what you were doing, and you had to kind of figure out how to be a good stranger. You were positioned in a culture that you weren't familiar with, much as our war fighters are. So it was a training project for the military. But what you know more about already, and what I'm most excited to chat with you about, is this notion of social physics and Bad News. So social physics is, inspired by this notion of real-time or regular physics, but in a social narrative setting. So we have seen, or perhaps you've seen in your what you've seen by reading is that these systems basically have these three ideas: the social state, volition formation, and action selection. The social state captures everything that can be captured about an individual character, and this is all just kind of it can be traits that are, true or false. This is a character of Buzz. He's flirtatious, he's arrogant, he's currently in a bad mood. There are lots of characters in these worlds. They have their own sets of traits. And then we have these influence rules, which essentially are just, predicate logic, conjunctions of predicates. And if the left-hand side of a rule evaluates to true, then the right-hand side affects a volition of a character. These volitions are how the characters wish to change the state of the world. And so you can just say, just some very simple ones. If a character is flirtatious, they're going to be more inclined to want to date people. If a character is jealous, they're going to be more of a loner. They're going to be less likely to befriend people. If they're in a bad mood, maybe they're going to be, less looking for love. They just want to be by themselves right now. And as I said, these can be, conjunctions that can be as arbitrarily complicated as we want. So like, if someone is arrogant and someone else isn't popular, then that arrogant person is going to be less likely to want to befriend them. And again, we can see that, it's predicate logic. So we're actually passing in different objects, different terms here. So, through this volition formation process, we end up figuring out what characters want to do with one another, and these things can be ambiguous, right? Characters can be ambivalent. One of the big design goals that we had for this is that a lot of the characters that we found really compelling in, media experiences and television is that they feel conflicted. They have these differing forces playing upon their desires. And seeing how they react when they're under this, social pressure or internal pressure that might be conflicting is oftentimes where a lot of excitement comes, where a lot of drama comes. And so here we can see, Buzz wants to date Monica because he's flirtatious, but he's also currently in a bad mood, which wants him to date Monica a little less. And so in this way, we try to capture, these opposing forces, this ambivalence a little bit. And so, there's lots of different rules. There's also, I guess, the important thing to keep in mind is that these characters aren't just operating in vacuums. These characters are parts of these larger worlds that have lots and lots of characters all at play. So here we can say, okay, we live in a world that has Buzz, but also this woman, Monica, but also this person, who we'll call, Cassandra. Let's say that Buzz and Cassandra are currently dating, but Buzz is attracted to Monica. And let's say that based on all of those influence rules, Buzz decides to ask Monica out, even though he knows that he's already in a relationship with Cassandra. But, sometimes people make bad decisions. Also, I guess I should say, this is considered a bad decision in a world where we are assuming that monogamy is the social norm. I think probably most of us live in a monogamous default world, but if we don't, hey, that's okay. The system, based on how you write your influence rules, can accommodate for any type of situation that you're trying to go for. But let's say in this world, monogamy is a social norm. In spite of that, Buzz decides that he wants to date Monica. Monica is her own person. She has her own set of volition rules. Just because Buzz asks her out, of course, doesn't mean that she's just going to accept it. But in this situation, she likes Buzz, so she's going to be more inclined to accept. Maybe she doesn't have anything else better going on, so she's interested in having some fun. And so Buzz asks Monica out, and they start a new relationship. Lovely. However, again, as we said, they're not just living in this vacuum. They're all working alongside each other. And so there's this other set of trigger rule that is good for kind of recognizing important patterns in the social state and then enacting immediate change based on those patterns. And so we can, for example, say, if, someone is dating someone else, first, and then after this predicate gets established in our, knowledge base, in the database, if after that point, that same person starts dating a second person, then we can apply some labels. We can say that, that person who's dating two person is a cheater. We can say that the person who he was dating first was, the first date, and the person he's dating second is the second date. I'm using perhaps gentle terms. You might, if you're being a little bit more evocative, you might label this person as the home wrecker. You might label this person as the home wrecked. Again, what these predicates are up to you as you use the system. There's, in addition to looking at the current state, as you know, Prom Week looks at the entire history of the state. and or the entire history of the player's playthrough. And what we are kind of proud of is that we found, this is like a picture of the team. This is me down there. This is, I don't know, circa 2012. Here are other people who maybe you've read their work or have met. Aaron Reed, Duncan Bozeman, Josh McCoy, Mike Trainer, Christian, Laura, Ryan, Zane, and Alex. Wow, cool. Good to see everyone. Many of these people are undergrads. Many of these people are undergraduate students. And so one of the things that was exciting for us was trying to create a system that would be easy for people with very little like experience to be able to come down and like do meaningful authoring work in. And they were able to do it, which we feel indicates that it's a set of metaphors that translates well to authors. But how does it translate to the player experience? Well, I am a big fan. I am a big advocate that creating an AI system is all well and good, but until you actually embed it in a playable experience, you don't necessarily know just how good it is, because the player experience is kind of the be all end all, the final law. So we incorporated it into the game Prom Week. Again, it sounds like you've read a little bit about it, but this is how Prom Week goes a little bit. You have kind of a god's eye view of a bunch of characters. You click on a character. I'm about to click on Oswald. I'm about to pretend that I'm clicking on Oswald. Click. We click on Oswald, and then we click on another character. Let's say that I've clicked on Doug, and now I know there's a lot going on the screen, but this is all of the stuff that Oswald wants to do with Doug. We can see he wants.
So just so you know, we actually played Prom Week in class. So we have seen and played this firsthand.
Amazing. Okay, so we don't have to talk about any of the interface things. I do want to highlight, and hopefully you guys observed this when you played it, is that we can see, oh, what does Oswald want to do? Oh, show off, insult, bully. Sounds like Oswald doesn't really care for Doug very much, but also he wants to woo him. Like he seems to have some romantic feelings for Doug as well, which is getting a little bit at what we were talking about with that, like, wanting characters to embody ambivalence, wanting characters to be able to have these conflicting forces playing upon them, and for you as the player to be able to then guide them in those ways based on your desires. So if you were to diagram out like all of the different possible playthroughs of the game, there's a huge there's a good branching factor. We can see that it's a little hard to tell, I imagine, but each color represents how many players went down that path. Each one of these columns basically represents a different player's playthrough of Prom Week, or a different possible path through Prom Week. And by the time that it gets to blue, that means that a player is experiencing state that no other player had ever experienced before. And this is just like a fraction of one. This is like a 10th of the playthroughs of one of our levels, one of our campaigns, of which in Prom Week there are 10. So if we were to look at the entire playthrough of Prom Week, it would be a lot bigger than this. But it seems promising that like Prom Week enables players to pretty rapidly get themselves into positions that no other player has ever experienced before. And so thank you all for you playing the game and for contributing your data to this chart. And again, if we compare that to like Cave of Time, we compare that to like the Choose Your Own Adventure books, like the amount of variation is immense. And it's not just from like a graph standpoint. We chat with players about it. And one of the things we're most proud of, perhaps surprisingly, is that a lot of players who play Prom Week feel bad about themselves. I hope, speaking of ambivalence, I hope that wasn't the case for you. I hope that when you played it, I hope that you enjoyed it. At the same time, like the fact that the players actually felt responsibility and felt some guilt over manipulating these characters uh, felt really exciting to us. And particularly, we've had many people say, oh, I just naturally assumed that in order to achieve my goals, I had to be like nasty, I had to be mean. But then I played the game again and I realized, oh my gosh, like I was actually able to like solve everything by being kind. Like what does that say about me? What does that say about my own kind of like internal biases or the way that I view the world? That's kind of one of the sweet spots. That's one of the things that like I hope to do with my work in general is cause introspection. Also, it won a lot of awards and was nominated for a lot of awards, and we're really proud of it. It's been incorporated in a lot of other like research projects, and a lot of these we've already talked about across academia and also in industry. And great, yeah. Prom week, the world's quickest tour. We're doing okay.
Well, is this a moment? I have a question or two sort of related to prom week.
Go for it.
Want to talk bad news first?
No. Let's open it up.
So something that came up in our class discussion was that this basic architecture of like you have events that can happen and you have kind of preconditions that are defined on like when the event can apply, and you sort of opportunistically do it. Like there's not a lot of long-term planning. It's sort of a 3D kind of like, you make your decisions in the moment.
Absolutely.
And
yes.
To my mind, the big innovation that Comme il faut provided was over something like, say, Universe, was that instead of having these very explicitly defined, it has to be this and exactly this as your preconditions, you had all these things that were contributing and that were sort of applying these weights.
Yes.
And so it was no longer a, yes, this applies or no, it doesn't. It was, you could rank everything and pick the best things, and then you could even do that, stochastically or whatever.
Yeah.
But it also means that it's like harder to predict what's going to happen. You get some weird, unexpected results. So part of this was we just wanted you to tell us like what were your misspun tales? What were some like weird like, oh, the system it doesn't have a bug, but we got some strange behavior out of it.
When did gravity drown? Yeah. So.
And just in general related to this, like, what were your lessons learned about doing this? Like, is this a better model than the Universe? It has to be this and exactly this kind of situation. And what are the pitfalls? What advice do you have for other people using SIF or something like it? What pitfalls to avoid? What strengths to capitalize on?
Yeah. These are really great questions. I would say, like with prom week, it's actually very deterministic. It could be more stochastic, but it's very deterministic. And I like, because of the way that the game prom week was created, it was a very conscious design choice for us to make it deterministic, because we wanted players to be able to like replay the level again and again and to be able to like solve things. At the same time, I think that ends up, for anyone who ends up playing the game again and again, it ends up spoiling a little bit of the magic, because if you do the exact same thing the same way every time, it ends up being exactly the same, which I think robs it a little bit of this like, oh, these characters are these flesh. Maybe I'm biased because I did have to play the game again and again and again, and so I saw the characters do the exact same things. I think if you are like, it's like, it depends a little bit on the experience that you're embedding it in, and if you are embedding it in an experience where there is a solution, like finding this balance of giving the player the capacity to learn and improve their gameplay, but also I think having the characters still kind of feel like they are the flesh and blood living characters is a tricky balance to walk, and one that I think we haven't necessarily like perfected yet. The other like major thing, and again, maybe this is a little tangential to your question, but it's like the first thing that comes to my mind, Stephen, is figuring out just how much information to present to the player was a like huge like design problem. And again, another one that I don't think we like solved, because we erred on both sides throughout the design process. Like we erred on like, we're basically not going to tell the player like anything. Like we'll give them like the bare minimum information, and like that didn't feel good. Like it's like when they changed the social state, they couldn't like see that they changed it. When the characters were doing things, it was like hard for them to understand why on earth like is this character acting in this way, other than like maybe like leveraging, and this was a little bit by design as well, leveraging preconceived notions of like, oh, this guy looks like a nerd, this girl looks like a popular girl, so yes, she's gonna treat the nerd badly or whatever. But like other than just kind of those like surface level like connotations that people might bring with the experience itself did very little in the way of helping the player. Conversely, we also experimented giving these huge information dumps, and we found players would play like one turn. It's like they would read everything, go like, okay, spend half an hour deciding I'm going to have this character, do this with this character, see the output, and admittedly delight in it. Like I do think that like the quality of that interaction was high for that type of player who had that level of patience, was like, oh my gosh, that makes so much sense because of the half hour of research that I just did learning about them. But then it's like, okay, time for another half hour long experience before another move. So I guess all of that is to say, like the advice that I'm trying to say is this is a system that if you want players to be able to make informed, meaningful play, they need to have a lens into the system. They need to have a lens into like what the characters know and what their relationship is with each other, what their history is with each other. Finding ways to present that information that is immediately like grokkable is pivotal, and also intimately connected with the actual like playable experience that you're trying to create. In our case, we set up these like design constraints with, you know, we want there to be puzzles that you can solve, but we also never want you to feel like you lost. Like even if you didn't solve any puzzles, we still want the ending to be like your story. So we were like trying to like do all of those things. Maybe if we change some of those decisions, right? It's like, no, either you solve it or you don't. And like, if you don't solve it, you have to replay the level again. That would be a very different experience, but arguably one that maybe Comme il Faut lends itself more naturally to, possibly. All interesting thoughts and questions to think about. Stephen, that was a lot, and I don't even know if I actually addressed what your specific question was, but are you satisfied?
Yeah, sure. Do any questions from anyone else on prom week specifically before going into bad news?
Yeah, I had a question. You mentioned that the result of the player's actions were deterministic, and I guess the campaigns are hand authored. Would there be a way to keep the system deterministic in regards to the relationships between the characters, but maybe generate the narrative of the campaign somehow?
So I just want to make sure that we're on the same page when we say that the campaigns are hand authored. Some aspects of them are hand authored for sure. So any given campaign, what I mean by that is like, oh, I click on, Zach's level, and then Zach has, however many, like 3 individual levels. So that is a campaign. And the hand-authored parts of that are the starting state. So what the pre-existing relationships with all of those characters are, the number of levels. So in Zach's campaign, it's 3, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly. And the specific people who show up in each level and the puzzles to solve. So those are the hand-authored parts. But in terms of the what shows up, like when you click on 2 characters and like what are the options that are present, other than the very first turn, which will always be the same because the history, the pre-existing relationships are hand-authored, and thus the very first turn, the calculation will always be the same. After that, everything that the characters start doing with each other are now being like influenced by you, right? So it's not like we hand-authored like every single thought bubble for every single pair of characters for every single like time step. So I just want to make sure we're on the same page.
Yep,
okay.
Same page. Yep.
Great. So then, so yeah. I mean, in terms of like being able to like dynamically generate the puzzles, that's not a thing that we explored in prom week, but it absolutely could be, right? It's like, and there could be a number of ways that you think about doing that. It could be, we want there as authors to be something that involves romance. We want, Zach to specifically fall in love with someone, but we don't know who at first, but then we like dynamically, figure out based on the player, oh, Zach is spending a lot of time with Naomi, so let's have Naomi be the target. Like stuff like that could be cool. We have that like a little bit by having puzzles that don't look for specific characters, right? Like we have puzzles that are make Zach date someone, and then it's like the player can choose like, okay, well, I'll have them date whoever I want. But that does have a little bit of a different feeling than the game commanding you, make Zach date this specific person, but that specific person was dynamically determined by their gameplay. I think that's interesting. That's cool.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Great. Maybe we can move on to bad news.
Sounds great. Cool. So I imagine none of you have played Bad News yet. That would be very impressive indeed. But the idea behind Bad News is that it combines this computer simulation, live performance, and also this Wizard of Oz technique to try and bridge a gap between our current moment and this beautiful imagined future. This beautiful imagined future of, for lack of a better term, the Star Trek holodeck. This idea of an interactive narrative that is completely adapting and dynamically altering to create a beautiful story in which you are the star. The technology isn't quite there yet, but again, with all of your help, we can get it there. We just wanted to try and like create this approximation of it. Like, what would a game like this feel like given the current technology that we have right now? And it's framed in this kind of like somewhat morbid setting about death and death notification in everyday life. Forgive the WikiHow graphics. You are in the game, you're a county mortician's assistant. You're exploring a small American town in 1979 that has like 140 years of generated history. While playing the game, you sit like behind a curtain, behind a little like model theater. You've got like a little notepad, you've got a little like tablet with information about the game, giving you information about where you're at, interactive fiction style. You are at the grocery store, you are at the bank, you see a bank teller, you see a janitor. You play the game by speaking your commands out loud, and those commands are then heard by this wizard, here portrayed by the inestimable James Ryan, who, based on what you're saying, kind of updates the underlying simulation accordingly. So the things that you're saying out loud, the things that you're doing, enable you to travel throughout the town. You can look up business and residential directories, visit places, knock on doors and ring buzzers, go to businesses and houses, and most importantly, talk with people. Most importantly, have these conversations with folks who are then embodied by a live actor who can basically say anything he wants. And you as the player can basically say anything that you want. You have specific goals that you're trying to achieve. We'll chat about that in just a moment. I think you know if you've read the paper. And the actor, who portrayed here by me, can say anything as long as we are true to the simulation, as long as we are being honest with whatever character I'm currently portraying, or the actor is currently portraying. And so I have this whole like interface that has like all of this information on it about like, where am I along the big 5 personality traits, and like, oh, we're talking about this like other person, like who is this other person and how do I feel about them? How does this character feel about them? So every time that the player like knocks on a door or like starts a conversation, this like pops up on my screen because James like sends it to me, and I have to like very frantically like get all of it loaded up into my mind so that I can then give as believable a performance as I possibly can, given the time constraints. And it's, you know, I sometimes in other situations I'm more cagey about it, but here there's no secret. I'm the actor, but in theory it could be anyone. And so, yeah. But so far it's basically always been me. So the actual world generation begins with a kind of like high level simulation where we begin with empty plots of land, families move in, they start farmsteads, they live their lives as the years go on, more people move in, people get married, they have children, they start new businesses, they build new homes, the topography of the town grows and grows and grows. And while all of this is happening, in addition to the town growing, the townsfolk are growing as well. Not only are they, you know, growing in terms of age and professions and things such as that, but they're also communicating with each other. They're sharing their perception about the world with one another, which gives each individual character their own model of the world. And this model can fade over time. This model can be incorrect because of a number of reasons. As I said, memories fade over time. Maybe, you know, characters just never actually learned any given thing, so they're just not sure about something. But also, characters can lie to each other. And in that way, lies can propagate throughout the town, meaning that any given character that you speak with as a player, you can't necessarily completely trust. So the game itself, as I said, like one thing that's very important to us is that it's a game about real life. It has sort of a mundanity to it. Like it's about people that have jobs and families and friends. They run errands, they go to work, they just have leisure time hanging out at bars. And like, even though we don't have like long-term planning, even though we're not trying to like construct this beautiful like, you know, narrative, through just having all of these characters living their lives, beautiful emergent narrative naturally bubbles up. And this does mean that there's a lot of work, and this is actually one of the things that I'm kind of like currently working on with James and Adam, with my Bad News colleagues. We're trying to find ways to automate this process and make life a little bit easier for the humans involved, so that there can be slightly more or slightly less dependence on like doing Python live coding and exploring the underlying system. But the wizard is updating the simulation, but also like sifting through the simulation. If you've done any reading into like story sifting, like looking into what exists to find these emergent narratives, because the system at present doesn't, you know, do any of that heavy lifting for you. A human has to like recognize, this is a good story, and then he feeds that to me, basically, and then I feed that to the player. So there's a lot of work. Again, there's a lot of manual human labor going on inside of this. But even though like, oh yes, we're computer scientists, oh yes, we're excited about automation, like that's also where a lot of the joy, I think, of playing this game comes from for the player and the actor and the wizard, is this act of like searching through all of these mundane lives and finding these little meaningful moments in these simulated characters, and then meaningfully bringing them to life in a way that enables the player to get to know them and interact with them. The player experience, again, we've kind of like alluded to this a little bit. If you've read it, you already know. But I guess one thing that I do want to highlight that's important to me is that we care deeply about what's called a contract of care. This is a situation that involves death. It's a situation that involves even if it's only simulated death, it involves some heavy themes. And so we want to make sure that at any given moment, the player understands that they're loved, that they're well taken care of, that they can leave at any time. So we have this extra diegetic guide who kind of explains what the player can do, make sure that they're feeling okay. And then the guide goes away. And then the player is met with essentially this tablet explaining that they have encountered a deceased person. And then they meet the county mortician. The mortician is the only character who isn't procedurally generated. The mortician is a character that we create that makes sure that the very first encounter that the player has is a positive one. Stephen, you were asking about misspun tales in Prom Week. There are a ton of misspun tales in Bad News of like players wandering, like in early prototypes, players wandering the town for like 30 minutes, like not finding anyone, and then finally finding someone and them being like a total jerk and like shutting the door in their face. So we decided that like having a kind person at the beginning was a very important thing for the player experience. So the mortician, I'm so glad you're here. The mortician makes it very clear that we care about the player. We love the player. They explain that they have to identify who the deceased is, notify the next of kin. And then also, and this is, so as Stephen might have said, as might have been clear, like I have a background in theater. Like I have a PhD in computer science, but I also have a graduate degree in theater. And so this next part was really fascinating for me with my theater background. I would have thought that players would have been really like nervous about role playing just in general. And like there was a little bit of that going on. But then what we found was that by asking the player to, in addition to like role play by walking around the town, to create a cover story, kind of this like secondary mask on top of their like game playing mask, it kind of gave them the capacity to create their own scaffolding. And it actually, I think, made them feel more comfortable than if they didn't have that. Anyway, interesting. So yeah, the contract of care, we talked about that earlier. Just very important that we keep the players feeling happy and safe. And then eventually the player finds the next of kin and notifies them of the death. And like, I'm going through this like very quickly, like I'm kind of not giving this the kind of like solemnness or somberness that perhaps it deserves, but like we were really moved. Like we've played Bad News like hundreds of times by this point. And we are always moved by how much our players end up being moved frequently. Like they're frequently moved to tears. Like they frequently like will do things like ask the characters to like leave the room. Like if the next of kin is in like a public setting, they'll like ask the next of kin to like meet them someplace private so that they can deliver the news privately. And it's like, by public setting, that's all in the simulation. Like, it's just me and that other person, right? Like, there's only two people involved, and yet the world feels real to these players. Yeah, it's from more than 100 at this point, and like they feel, I guess, transported is what I'm highlighting here. The world feels very genuine to them, even though it's like they're just completely sitting down. They have basically an interactive fiction style like description of the rooms that they're in, and they have me, and I'm like, I'm an okay actor. I'm certainly not like the most brilliant, and yet even with my acting abilities, like we're able to create this world for players that feel like there's real stakes here. And Bad News won a lot of awards as well that we're really proud of. It's been, featured in, at Kai, at various, conferences and, festivals. It won the Indiecade Audience Choice Award, which we're very proud of. It performed at Slam Dance, which is the sister festival of Sundance in Park City, Utah. We showed at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. So it's been this experience that's appealed to a lot of different demographics, like computer scientists, games folks, film folks, art folks. And so, yeah, I have a little bit more to say about some other projects, but this is probably another good breathing point if people have any questions about Bad News.
I have just a question / an invitation to speculate on future work.
Yeah.
I think the coolest, I'm not alone in this, many people thought the coolest thing about Bad News was, unlike so many other systems developed in our field, which have been we have this lofty goal, but we don't have the technology, so what can we do with the technology you have? You guys took sort of the opposite approach, which was, we have this lofty goal and we don't have the technology, so we're going to use people instead. We're going to fudge it. We're going to find the technology, even if it's not, the way we eventually want it to work. Do you have, and I love that approach. I think it led to an incredible experience. Do you have any intentions to apply that same idea to future work, or advice to people looking to take that same route?
Yeah. So with the second one, I'll address that first. The advice to people taking the same route. I think what I will say is, Bad News, that was not what you just described, although I completely agree is what happened. That was not the route that we ourselves took. When we were creating Bad News, we weren't hey, let's do this amazing thing. With Bad News, let's approximate this amazing thing by using human technology, which then ended up being a thing that some might argue is amazing in and of itself. What we did was, Bad News began its life essentially as a prototype to gather data for a fully digital experience. So basically we were using it just as a mechanism to generate dialogue utterances. What do people actually say in these situations, so that we can build up this data set and then maybe use that to help inform characters sounding more believable in this digital experience. And we happily discovered that digital experience, well, this part was less happy, that digital experience was falling a little flat. People weren't enjoying that experience, but people were walking away from this prototype, which ultimately became Bad News, feeling it was really intense, and feeling they had actually just had this meaningful experience. So I guess the advice that I give is in addition to just hey, don't forget that in many ways we are designing experiences for humans, and we are humans, and humans are really good at a lot of things, and don't feel you're cheating, or don't feel you're not allowed to leverage human capacity, right? If there is an experience that would benefit from what humans are good at, keep that in mind. Think about how you could leverage humans in the loop as a very important thing. But then I think the other kind of big general takeaway, which imagine most of you have probably heard before if you've taken prototyping classes or game design classes, is to follow the fun, right? Even if you have an idea in your mind about this is what I'm working on, and this is what the project is, and this is what the project is going to be, if in your prototyping phase or if in your early development work, you end up recognizing like, oh, wait a second, like this is what people are gravitating towards. Maybe I should, shift towards that instead. Like I think maybe the classic example that you've heard of is like Will Wright, right? Like working on he was working on like a flight simulator game, but was like way more excited about like imagining like the little like the map editor and like the little like towns that were being created that you're flying over, and then that became like the inspiration for like SimCity. That wasn't necessarily him following the fun of what the players were finding and engaging. I think that was him following his own fun, but that's valid too. That's also good. So yeah, in terms of like that set of advice, I think that is what I would say with that. Then in terms of like future work, this isn't so I would say that like the most appropriately aligned future work that I'm working on in regards to this is again with Adam Somerville and James Ryan, and we're working on kind of this like project that eventually has like a lot of directions, but right now the most concrete thing I can point you towards is Kismet. Kismet is a small social simulation language is how we're kind of like marketing it. And we wrote about it at the Casual Creator Workshop at the recent ICCC conference, the International Conference on Computational Creativity. And so you can read a little bit about how we're taking some of the ideas of bad news and Talk of the Town, the AI system that produces bad news, and trying to democratize that, basically. Try to create a little like domain-specific language that people can use to create their own little micro worlds, their own little worlds. And then we have like further steps to use that to create essentially a class of bad news likes. And like as part of that, like we're planning on trying to like experiment with maybe not automating fully aspects of it, but having more like mixed initiative approaches so that like the wizard isn't purely like relying on their own like knowledge, but is able to like work with the system, work with like a story sifting system to be able to look at what's been simulated, find some of those like emergent narratives, and then present them to the player. So I think that is then the first question that you asked. I attempted to answer it.
I had a question about, in the paper, we get an example of a playthrough of bad news, and I'd be curious to hear what the most memorable or the best playthrough was and how it compared to the worst or the sort of least expected playthrough.
Okay, amazing. Yeah, great question, Luke. There are so many great examples and so many terrible examples. It's hard to pick. I'll start with this example that I think was really incredible. We had a player, unbeknownst to us, who in his real life job worked for the military as someone who notifies like spouses of the deaths of their next of kin. And so like his job in real life is to notify the next of kin. And so in the beginning, like I say that there's like that mortician sequence, usually players are like a little nervous during that moment. And so it's kind of like try to make it feel a little like comforting and lighthearted. And like I ask, as the mortician, do you know what you need to do? And usually the players are like, oh yeah, I think I do. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this. This guy was completely matter of fact. Yes, I know exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to go around the town and gather as much information as I can and give as little information as possible out of respect for the family and the deceased. Then, once I find the information that I need, I'm going to go directly to the next of kin, and I'm going to respectfully but efficiently inform them of the death. And like, I'm like, yeah, yes, that's exactly what you're going to do. And he like because he knew exactly what to say, because he was so practiced about it, he like caught me off guard. Like he was like saying things to characters that like, regardless of the character's personality, like they're going to like work with them. Like they're going to like be like, oh, okay, yeah, like clearly this is really urgent and very important. Yeah, I can tell you where this guy worked. That's fine. And so he like, normally maybe we play more coy, like, oh, this character is like a little, you know, disagreeable, so they're not gonna like play along. But it's like this player was so good at getting information that we just gave it to them. They found the next of kin in literally 5 minutes. Usually we aim for you to find the next of kin. We try to craft the experience that they find the next of kin at the end of about an hour, but they found them at the end of 5 minutes. And then we ended up doing kind of this like, yeah, it was crazy. And then this was a little bit of serendipity, a little bit of like acting on my part, but like the next of kin, the story worked out beautifully, was someone who had married multiple times in the past and had been a widower, and their husband had just died again at this playthrough. And so I kind of made the executive decision, and this is like another thing that we could talk more about, is that we are true to the simulation, to what the simulation simulates, but there are some things that aren't covered by the simulation, and we kind of give ourselves, or I give myself, free reign to like fill in those gaps. So I made the decision of saying, you know what? This isn't the first time that this character has met someone like this, because her previous 2 husbands have passed away as well. And so I made the decision of this person kind of like shooing that person away, like saying that they're not the next of kin. The player then goes and like, you know, experiences the game a little bit more. And then eventually like all of the signs point them back to that first person that they found because they were right. And so it was like, you know, a 30-minute gameplay session. And then like at the end, and again, like it's a little bit like describing a dream. I recognize it's a little bit of a you had to be there energy, but at the end, he is doing his like messaging that he has practiced and rehearsed in his real life countless times of like, ma'am, I regret to inform you. And like, he's like going through this like spiel, and like I, as my character, so I'm embodying this character who has lost 2 husbands and has just lost another one, who's like saying like, I knew the moment that I met you, what the news that you had was. Twice in my life I've been married before, and twice in my life young men just like you have approached me, just like you're approaching me now. And like both of us were kind of like giving these like dramatic monologues, if you will, like talking over each other. Like the energy was like really high, and like it ends with him dramatically saying like, ma'am, I regret to inform you your husband has passed away. And like, and that's like the end. And then we like close.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and so like that, I think, was maybe one of the most powerful experiences, and like powerful and unique. Like we have a lot of like the experiences that end with people crying, which also makes us feel like sad and good and everything. But that was, yeah, there was never any other experience that was just like that. And then yeah, like the number of bad experiences. Thankfully fewer, but like sometimes I would say bad experiences came from 2 places. And the first place we addressed, they came from us like learning that we had to kind of like juice the system a little bit. So like before, when we first started, anybody could die, anybody could be the death. And like that means it might have been someone who was in a same room as someone else. And so there's a dead body just like in the middle of the living room. Clearly that didn't work. Maybe it was someone who was super popular, and so every single person knew them. Too easy. Maybe it was a hermit. Literally no one knew them. Impossible. The player never found any leads. So we like found some parameters of like, oh, they need to have this many connections, and they need to be alone, and they need to be this, and they need to be that. So that eliminated a lot of like some of the like easy bad playthroughs. But then, you know, you can't account for what players are going to do sometimes. And so I'll share two stories. One story is I'm pretty sure the players had taken drugs before we started, and the drugs didn't kick in until halfway through the gameplay session because it started totally fine. And then in the middle, they started doing weird things like eating the residential directory. Like they asked, could you hand me the residential directory? And it's like, okay, I pantomime it. They have it already, whatever. And then they like pantomime like eating it and go, yum, delicious. And like at that moment, we're like, okay, this is not going to be one of those beautiful playthroughs. And then another playthrough, which I hesitate to call it bad, but it's bizarre, and we tried to like ask the player about it afterwards, but we never got an answer. The playthrough itself was like normal, like a standard playthrough, not extraordinary, but not poor by any means. They found the next of kin. They 100% identified the next of kin. And then instead of notifying them, they left. They went back to like the apartment complex that they started in where the deceased was. They talked to the janitor, who was the very first person that they had a conversation with. And they just said, hey, there's someone dead in room 331. And then like walked away. And like that's like losing the game, right? Like you're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to notify the next of kin, but clearly it was a very like intentional choice on their part, or I think it must have been. And we tried asking like what was going through their mind, and they were a little bit like, I don't know, just felt like it. So it's, yeah, like that's a memorable, unexpected one, if not bad.
Thanks. That's a great answer. That's so cool.
Thank you. So my watch says we're at 11:02, and my understanding is that your class only lasts an hour. Is that true?
We're like 10 minutes over.
I'm
If
so
you don't
sorry.
have to immediately jet and are willing to take another question or two, I am happy to keep the Zoom call running.
Yeah.
Hey Ben, I had a comment.
Hey Rachel.
That was really interesting about the guy, the military guy. That occurs to me, like Chris, my husband, has done that. My understanding is that the Army like makes regular people do that like a lot. That's a job that like sort of people cycle through. So I just thought it might be interesting. I don't know if you're like still doing bad news at any times or whatever, but it might be cool to like try that with people as a training thing or something similar to that, since a lot of people have to go through it.
Yeah. And I agree, Rachel. That is you're not the first person to suggest that. Some people who have played it have been like in the medical profession, and they've said that this like could be like a really good tool, like in general for like bedside manner, just like general like learning how to maybe deliver bad news of any kind to patients, but then also specifically in the military. And it's funny you ask. I'm literally in the middle of putting together a grant proposal where I am pitching using some of these experiences and some of this technology for training purposes. So I'm glad to hear you think it's a good idea, because I'm hoping that the Office of Naval Research agrees with you.
I have a more general question.
Yeah.
What do you think would be like a milestone that needs to be achieved in your field, of having the player interactions influencing the narrative for it to be used in like a commercial game?
Yeah. That is a really good question. And And I kind of have some cynical answers. I think I think it's like, first of all, like, I think by commercial game, like, I'm assuming that you're meaning, you know, like a big budget, like AAA game.
Yeah.
And so one of the big like factors about that is that like they have a lot of money on the line, and so they're risk averse, right? So it's very hard for them to motivate themselves to use something that may not happen. So like the answer to that question, I guess, is like, what would inspire to be used in a big budget game? Having a low budget game make millions of dollars using this technology. And then all of a sudden it's like, cool, great, it's been proven to be financially viable. Now, why hasn't a low budget game made millions of dollars? That, I think, maybe more than anything, might be like a question of design. Maybe like it's a lot of things, but I think there it is like, I think the onus might be on like us, on the researchers, to try to create this like experience that is something that has never been seen before, and that captures people's imaginations and pocketbooks, if you will. Like, you can point to AAA games that do some interesting things in this space. So maybe one common example or good example is a Shadow of Mordor, and like the Nemesis system. Like, the Nemesis system is like kind of only half a step away from Comme il faut in like many ways. If you're not familiar with it, a Shadow of Mordor, it's a Lord of the Rings game. You're a hero killing a million orcs and Uruk-hai or whatever, but like the Uruk-hai kind of have their own little like society, and like these own little like power structures, and they have these little like not that different from Sif-esque relationships with each other. And also, as you kill them, they create little relationships with you. Like, they get these new traits, like afraid of fire if you kill them with fire, or afraid of heights if you make them, you know, fall off of heights. And then that influences how they like interact with each other, how they interact with you, and a little bit about how they fight with you. And so that's just like one component of this larger game. Like, Prom Week, Ensemble or Comme il faut is like front and center. Shadow of Mordor, the Nemesis system, is a big part of it, but just like this one tiny aspect of it. I think that might be a good path forward. Although I'm really excited about these like new playable experiences where it's like, yes, Prom Week is a game that could only have been enabled by this like new technology. It might be an easier pill to swallow to go the like Nemesis system route of like, hey, here's like basically Assassin's Creed. Here's a game with a big open world where you're running around killing people. This is a formula that we know works and that gets a lot of money. But here's this one new gimmick. Here's this one new trick that's using this cool like interactive storytelling technology. Isn't this cool? Isn't this neat? And I think in that way, people might expand their minds. And I guess just to show both sides of the coin, a more recent example, and admittedly one that I'm a little less familiar with, but my understanding is that Watchdog Legion, or Watch Dogs Legion, has some like dynamic like backstory generation. It's not like Comme il faut, where it's like, oh, or Talk of the Town, Bad News for that matter, where it's like, oh, here's this huge underlying history that's always existed and influences what characters want to do. It's kind of a just-in-time historical generation where if you end up looking at a character, it will dynamically kind of create it on the fly. And my understanding is that, and again, I please take this with a grain of salt, but based on like the little bit that I've read and heard, that has fallen a little flat. Like, people have not found that to be engaging. And I think part of it might be, and this is kind of my personal take on it, is that sure, you have, thousands of characters that you can take control of, and each character has this like generated dynamic history, but because it's like not real, like because it's fabricated in the heat of the moment, I think we can tell. Like I think it rings false to us and doesn't quite have that same meaningful impact. And then also like the design of the game is kind of constructed such that like you're kind of going through these characters like Kleenex, and so you don't have a lot of time to fall in love with them. And so that's again like another like design consideration. Like I think one of the brilliant things about Shadow of Mordor is that yes, you kill them, but then they find ways to like come back so that you can fight them again and like revisit them again. So yeah, it's a lot of things. I think the industry itself is kind of set up to be risk averse for understandable reasons. So finding ways to make it show that it's a safe bet is a good way to do it. And perhaps one path to achieving that is by taking tried and true game concepts, but like incorporating these existing systems inside of them to show that they can live together in harmony, and then in this way slowly trick AAA studios into creating bad news too.
Yeah, those are really good points. Thanks.
Oh, thank you.
Are you aware that they patented the Nemesis system?
Yeah, I am, and I have no. This is this is probably just me telling myself stories that make me sleep better at night. This probably isn't true, but folks from EA, who I believe were the publishers of Shadow of Mordor, came to Santa Cruz while we were working on Prom Week, and like we gave a presentation about Prom Week and SIF to them, and like they seemed really into it. They seemed really excited about it. And then like Shadow of Mordor came out like a few years later. Probably a coincidence, probably not anything that I can claim any ownership over, but like there is like a small part of me that wonders like, was there any influence at all from that meeting and the Nemesis system? And I'll never know. If there is, it was probably very slight, but yeah, I am aware that they patented it.
Got time for one more?
Yeah.
So obviously one of the big unknowns in bad news as it is done is just how much is being added by interacting with a real human who processes natural language perfectly and can fill in reasonable assumptions and all that. Like obviously it has some effect, and the question is that all of it, or is that only a small part of it? Have you ever just gone back and looked at the logs, like all the a game that successfully happened? Just go back and say, if we look at only the digital parts of this, so just where they went, who they talked to, and just like the information content of what they got, regardless of the actual like dialogue and facial expressions and feelings of it. Like, how does a log compare to an experience? Do the logs still feel good? Do they still feel like maybe they're interesting stories, or would you say it's like really the extra detail that makes it?
So So to answer your question directly, we haven't really spent a lot of time just looking at the digital parts of it. But I would imagine that if we were, the stories would like Stephen, forgive me, this is kind of a weird callback, or it's a callback to a thing that maybe you didn't see. Have you read about, or do you know about Nick Montfort's like ellipsis, like poetry generator?
Ooh, not that one specifically.
Oh, okay. So maybe this is like a bad connection, but like Nick Montfort basically, in 5 minutes created this like poetry generator where there's like a poem and it will just kind of randomly, I don't think there's any intelligence behind it, replace lines of the poem with ... with an ellipsis. And like he found that like that was really powerful and people like fill in those gaps in like these really meaningful ways. And so hearing you like ask like if you just looked at the logs, I think any power it would have would be similar to that same like ellipsis generator. Like, because the log itself would be like, player went to bar, player initiated conversation with bartender, player initiated conversation with patron, player left bar, player went there. Like certainly it's like, that's even less exciting than Tailspin, right? Like in terms of the like surface level text generation. But I do think we as humans like are good at filling in those gaps with like, oh, because after that conversation, he went there, he must have like talked about something. And like, if like, so maybe, I guess, is the answer, but I think it would be hard. I do want to say though, on the same note, and this is, again, it's cheating because it's specifically people who, or not cheating, but it's like, it's an apples to oranges comparison because it's specifically people who just experienced the actual game. But after we play through Bad News, what we'll do is we'll generate an epilogue. So we'll let the simulation run for like another 20 years. And then it's a little bit like, where are they now? Like at the end. And so we let the player, we let the audience, we let the people visit, like check in, not diegetically, but like just through like looking at the simulation. So in a very purely digital way, no acting, no embodiment. Oh my gosh, that guy who was the CEO of this company who was such a jerk to me, he ended up losing his company 5 years later, and now he's a stalker at the grocery store. Amazing. Oh my gosh. Oh, those two people who loved each other so much, they never got married. Oh, they ended up never finding love with each other. Oh, that's so sad. Like, and just kind of like looking at like what you're saying, right? Like, in this year, this character did this. In this year, this character did this. A very dry presentation. Like, people find that, like, I think for some people, that is their favorite part of the entire experience. Now, admittedly, that takes on all of this meaning because they just had this hour-long adventure getting to know them in this embodied way. But it at the very least, it points to these logs of like character state being meaningful to people in some capacity.
That's really cool.
I have a quick aside just about those epilogues.
Yeah. What
would happen if the player lost the game and the next of kin was never notified?
So here is I feel a little bit like I'm revealing a magic trick. I feel a little bit like I'm revealing a secret, but like, I think it's okay, Michael. I know you're cool. I know you won't share it with anyone. Okay. Whether or not characters know about the deceased, like, that's not simulated particularly. So it's like, even if I notify the next of kin of the death, like, it's not going to influence how they like live their lives, basically.
Oh, okay.
Cool. Thank you, Ben, so much. We're almost half an hour over. Thank you for being willing to stick around and keep talking and answer questions and whatnot. Thank you so much, everyone. Virtual applause for Ben. Thanks again, and look forward to seeing all the cool new work you do in the future.
Me too. Thank you so much for having me, Stephen. Thank you so much for oh, Stephen, I just saw your chat. That's very kind. Thank you so much, everyone. It was a pleasure meeting you. If you have any questions, Stephen has my contact information. You can reach out to me.